For those of you who've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that I believe Riot does a better job reworking champions than they do new releases, with of course a few exceptions. And so today, I wanted to make a video on which champions got the best reworks. So for a little bit of context, Season 5 was when new champions came out that drastically changed how we see champion design, since they became much more unique, multi-dimensional, and in some cases a little ridiculous. Because of this, the older champions by comparison were part of an older, outdated model of League of Legends, and as a result, Riot has been taking steps to modernize them. There were some champions that merely received a retrofit of sorts, taking what existed before and updated them to fit the current game state, such as Volibear, Warwick, and Fiddlesticks, while other champions have been reinstated into the game completely unrecognizable from their previous iteration like Aatrox, Poppy, and Urgot. Over the past half-decade, we've had a little over 20 reworks, so I wanted to choose the best 5 that did the best job, with not only helping the champion feel better to play, but also fixing any degenerate playstyle they may have had that prevented them from ever seeing the light of day. Naturally, this will be based on my opinion and won't be in any particular order. It should also be addressed that just because the champion is really strong doesn't mean they're bad design. I'm anticipating a lot of comments condemning my choices simply because at one point or another that champion was like 60% win rate and they were super overpowered, but a champion's statistical performance or win rate is not conducive to how good their design is. So let me know in the comments section down below what you think the best 5 reworks are after the end of this video. Out of the 5, this might be a controversial choice, given how many support mains were traumatized by his reign of terror for all of Season 10. But considering how incredibly unhealthy his previous rendition was, Pantheon takes a spot as one of the best reworks on account of how they were able to maintain his entire kit in transition. Old Pantheon was, for all intents and purposes, a lane bully and not much else. It's no exaggeration to say that his only objective was to prevent the enemy top laner, or mid laner in some cases, from playing the game, like, at all. His passive allowed him to block any single basic attack or tower shot once, effectively shutting down any top laner that relied on hard-hitting basic attacks like Renekton, Jax, Garen, even Darius, and his W stun refreshed the passive so he can block 2 attacks or tower shots. Funnily enough, his passive wasn't even the biggest reason people hated him. It was the fact that his Q spear shot was a point-and-click ranged attack with ridiculously high damage. Gangplank's Q is one of the most annoying things to deal with as a melee top laner, but compared to Pantheon's Q, it's like going from a tap on the shoulder to a punch in the face. You don't do that! His entire playstyle consisted of harassing you from ranged while you couldn't engage on him whatsoever due to his passive and stun. I understand that doesn't sound all too different from how he is right now, but when it came to Pantheon, it was such monotonous gameplay for both those who played him and against him. Towards the mid to late game, he became one of the most useless champions because his entire kit was explicitly built for 1v1s and 2v2s, whereas in a team fight, it mostly came down to him trying to just take one person with him. Fast forward to his changes, Pantheon feels like an actual champion now. While he still is designed as an early game bully with high roaming potential, his new kit has turned him into more of a skirmisher or a bruiser than an off-meta cheese pick. Some argue his directional invincibility on Aegis Assault is a bit stupid to deal with, but it's a much healthier mechanic than the auto attack block because you have to cast it mindfully versus it just being on you forever. The passive change is way too reminiscent of Rengar's ferocity mechanic, but it gives him tools needed for certain situations. You would take Empowered Q if you needed good burst damage, you would take W if you wanted to prime Conqueror quickly, E for a burst of movement speed, and so on. Overall, the rework has allowed Pantheon to keep a lot of what made him such a strong early game threat, and gave him a whole new set of tools to survive the mid to late game while phasing out most of what made him so one-dimensional and cheesy to play against. It allowed most champions that used to be absolutely destroyed by him to have an actual chance to take him down even early game. I mentioned before that Warwick is my favorite rework in League of Legends, and while it may not be the best of the best, it's certainly very high up there. So old Warwick was also a very one-dimensional champion. Not nearly as frustrating as Pantheon, but arguably one of the simplest champions in the game. He basically just walks up to you and smacks you to death. That was his entire kit. He was one of the premier stat checkers in League of Legends for that reason, since apart from his suppress, which is also technically a stat stick ability, you just needed to be stronger than him in general. There's a rather infamous clip of I Will Dominate playing Warwick and literally taking his hands off the keyboard and auto-chasing down a Rengar until he dies off screen. It was a pretty fun time because if you could get a couple kills early game, very few champions if any could 1v1 you since you healed for so much while doing a decent amount of damage. Sadly, it didn't make for the most interactive gameplay because you were basically a worse version of Tryndamere or Master Yi. And so Riot decided to turn him into more of a tanky bruiser. His drain tanking capabilities were fine, but W and E were completely reworked to where Warwick became stronger and faster against low health targets while gaining access to an AoE fear that also greatly enhanced his durability. On top of that, Warwick's Q lets him bite onto targets and follow them, which you could use to chase down people who try to escape with dashes or blinks. All in all, his basic abilities added a lot more interaction than just walking up to someone and mashing Q and W as much as you could. Finally, Infinite Duress went from a point-and-click instant flash cast to a dash skill shot that calculated its range based on Warwick's movement speed. And since he got faster towards really low health targets, he can sometimes jump whole screens ahead to snipe out targets. The best part about Warwick's rework is that nothing really changed, similar to Pantheon. He still is a life-stealing machine that moves faster against low health targets and has a suppress. But Riot was able to rework him in a way that actually gave players the chance to outplay their opponent or take advantage of his unique tools to do what very few champions can do. He went from an on-hit juggernaut to a tanky bruiser with access to very interesting engage, which was a very creative way to change him. Unlike the first two we've talked about so far, instead of taking what was already there and revamping them to fit the modern design philosophy of the game, Galio was one of those champions who almost completely changed from his original design. Before, he was this really weird anti-mage champion with a bunch of random abilities that didn't seem to fit too well with this kit. For all intents and purposes, he was Malphite but got stronger from building magic resistance instead of armor. Two of Galio's attacks were long-range projectiles, one that slowed enemies and one that sped up allies, yet despite this, he was a melee champion which made very little sense. His ultimate was basically a better version of Nunu's Absolute Zero since it taunted enemies caught in it. But the problem was he had no way to really get in a good spot to hit a lot of targets because all he could do was just walk towards you. For the most part, he was this super niche pocket pick that you could only use if the entire enemy team consisted of only magic damage, which almost never happened at the time because back then, mages couldn't go bot lane yet and Corki and Kog'Maw were really the only magic damage AD carries. So they axed that and turned Galio from a wonky mage that countered mages to a full-on tank, cutting out a lot of his damage and adding way more crowd control. Of course, he still deals a good chunk of damage, but now he's no longer this tanky artillery mage but an actual tank. He still exceeds at countering magic damage users, but does a better job protecting his allies and locking down enemies with his massive amounts of crowd control. I know for a time he was a balanced nightmare because he was so tanky while also doing a lot of damage, but in terms of how he plays now versus how he played later, he feels so much more effective and reliable. I would dare say Galio is one of the few actual good AP bruisers in the game, which is hard to pull off because ability power items aren't really equipped for bruisers, but Riot was able to creatively take all of the positive things about Galio and mold them in a way that complements a tank's playstyle. Durable against all kinds of damage, but especially effective against magic damage, giving him his own little niche. Okay, so I know that I made a Why No One Plays Poppy video essentially tearing apart her rework, but hear me out on this. The main issue with Poppy was that a lot of her abilities are simply just not quite good enough, as in her W aura doesn't last long enough, her Q range is too short, or her E dash range is too short, things like that. Those can easily be fixed by buffing Poppy, that's a moot point. As for her design, we do not need to talk about old Poppy. Everyone remembers just how ridiculously absurd she was before her rework. Poppy was actually very similar to Warwick in that all she really did was run up to people and smash them to pieces until they died. Only instead of being a super life-stealy drain tank, she straight up was immune to any hostile interaction that included any kind of damage and crowd control. So it's similar to Mordekaiser's Death Realm, only much worse, for the enemy champion anyways. Instead, what they did was turn Poppy from a bruiser hypercarry to a tanky disruptor, throwing away her auto attack focus damage in favor of ability damage. While she still struggles to see a pick rate above 5%, Poppy's reworked kit is way healthier for both the player and opponent because it forces her and the enemy champion to be very mindful of their surroundings and how they use their abilities. Despite being very straightforward, a lot of how Poppy plays is punishing the enemy team's lack of awareness, such as using their dashes too predictably or not paying attention to where they are in relation to her. Poppy's old theme was all about drawing attention. You could not ignore her in the mid to late game because she could decide to absolutely destroy you whenever she wanted to. While reworked Poppy you can't do nearly as well in a 1v1 setting, she's extremely good at saying no you to the enemy team, especially in team fights, where Steadfast Presence and Keeper's Verdict can completely break her opponent's momentum or strategy when executed correctly. In essence, Poppy still remains as a very attention-grabbing champion, but rather than being a raid boss you have to take down immediately, she now specializes in shutting people down, something not too many champions do in this day and age. She's still a pocket pick, but can definitely throw people off guard with her unique disruption. By now you're probably wondering if I'm biased towards tank reworks, and Not entirely, I think it's mostly because those consist of a good half or more of all the champions that Riot has done full gameplay updates on, and usually tanks are the ones that I think come out the most well-fleshed. Shen didn't really change all too much from his previous state considering 2 of his abilities are exactly the same, but Pantheon's W and ultimate sort of carried over in the same way as well. One of the biggest issues plaguing Shen was that he really didn't, do anything, aside from taunt and ult people. Yes, Vorpal Blade gave him and his teammates a bit of health regeneration whenever they damaged that champion, and he could give himself a pretty solid shield every so often, but he just really didn't do much outside from the occasional taunt. So that's what his rework aimed to fix, and to this day, Twilight Assault is one of the best designed abilities I've ever seen. It's such a subtle mechanic to position your Spirit Blade in such a way that lets you deal bonus damage if it slashes an enemy champion, but it greatly amped up Shen's damage potential to the point where he can outduel even some bruisers. They ditched all form of HP sustain on his kit and made his defensive capabilities have a level of skill involved. For example, you could no longer just give yourself a free shield every few seconds. You had to land as many of your abilities as possible to get a shield instead, which also meant you had to time your shield properly rather than just have it available whenever. Spirit's Refuge has the same concept as Pantheon's Aegis Assault, where it's now a far stronger defensive tool than just blocking damage, as Shen can protect anyone in the zone from basic attacks for almost 2 seconds, essentially acting as an AoE Jax counterstrike. But because of its long cooldown and static position, it can either be really effective or really useless depending on how well you use it. That's the kind of champion design that I personally enjoy the most. It's perfectly fine giving champions a quote-unquote overpowered ability as long as it's only as good as the player's ability to take full advantage of it. Shen's one of the most technical tanks in the game because unlike other Hulkin Bulkins like Maokai or Malphite, who for the most part can be played by mashing your keyboard, Shen requires careful thought behind positioning, cooldown, and resource management, just like how Poppy requires situational awareness. It's definitely more exciting to see a champion reworked than it is to see a new champion released for me because as the saying goes, it's much easier to raise a child than to fix an adult. It's a much tougher challenge to take problematic, boring, or degenerate champions and try to renovate them by fixing up all the things wrong with them while still honoring their character's identity. Of course, not every rework was able to do a good job at that, but each of these 5 champions were known for something specific. It's just that everything else besides that specific was so bad that no one bothered to play them. Their reworks successfully captured that user experience and modernized it to be much healthier to play and play against. So what do you guys think? Do you believe there are other reworks that are better than the 5 I chose? Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite rework was in terms of gameplay and design. Again, just because a champion is super strong doesn't mean they're badly designed. Numbers can be adjusted if need be, that's what balance changes are for. Most of the time, it doesn't matter how strong or how weak a champion is, if there's something inherently wrong with their core gameplay, people will not play them. If you enjoyed this video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, please be sure to sub to the channel. Also check out the video description down below for links to my Discord and social medias, along with a playlist containing other discussions I've made for this game. But for now, that's it for today. Thank you all so much for watching this episode, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.